Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new venue. Those of you who've attended these conferences maybe even 10 times already, you'll notice that we have a new venue now, and I'm happy to be here. So, why are you all here? Let me start by asking you a question. Whom of you regard themselves primarily to be a scientist or an engineer? Of course, I started with that question because the contrasting question to that is, who of you regards themselves primarily to be an innovation manager? It's about 50-50, and there's a couple of people in the room who regard themselves to be something else, which I won't try and figure out right now. I started my career doing research. I did about 8 years of research, engineering, technology development. I did about 12 years of innovation management after that. And then I joined Lux, and I do whatever I do now. So the reason I ask is because I'm fascinated by this concept of innovation management, right? The enterprise that doesn't innovate ages and declines. And in a period of rapid change, and I think we can all agree this is a period of rapid change, the decline will be fast. So you have to innovate. Does anyone know who said this? I just said it, I know, but I stole it from someone else. Anyone? Peter Drucker said it. And that's actually relevant. That's what I would like to point out, because Peter Drucker, as you probably know, is one of the founding fathers of modern management theory, looking at things on operational management, like just in time, like how much do you outsource, how do you make your manufacturing lean and mean, right? So this is about operations management, and that turned from just leading a factory, right, being trained at a university, acquiring a master's degree maybe, and then being just pushed into manage a factory, into a trade of its own. And that happened throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. And the other thing Peter Drucker also said is, if you're outsourcing loads of things, there's two things you should be very careful about outsourcing. There's two basic functions. There's marketing and innovation. So congratulations to you all, even if you didn't raise your hand just now. You're probably part of one of the two basic functions of any company, which carries a high responsibility, but is also a fun place to be. So, what I think, and what I will tell you, what I will try to tell you, is that what happened to operations management is very comparable to where we are now in innovation management. We are in the 1980s as innovation managers, compared to where operation management was at the same time, right? So we're at the start of really maturing the profession of managing innovation. And I have a few thoughts to share with you about why that's happening, and also how to mature that profession. For now, you're on a roller coaster. Innovation has accelerated tremendously, and I'll show you a case of Volkswagen in a moment, just how tremendously that has accelerated. But it's a roller coaster, and speeding is fun, but you might want to have a safety belt. Let's take a look at Volkswagen. Why Volkswagen? Volkswagen is a pretty interesting example. For one thing, they're one of the few companies who managed to get all of their annual reports on the internet and searchable, dating all the way back to the 1960s. And you'll remember there was no internet in the 1960s, so they made quite an effort. And as an analyst, I'm so grateful. But also, there's a few other things that are interesting about them, which is that they have one of the longest continuous product lines, the Volkswagen Golf, that we can take a look at. And there are some recent events in Volkswagen history that raise some attention that we'll get to. So, what happened to innovation? And like I said, the 1980s and the 1990s really were about managing operational performance, just getting better at manufacturing, drilling down manufacturing costs, getting quality up to speed. And then around the end of the 1990s, even French cars didn't rust anymore. And so it became really difficult to just differentiate by being operationally excellent. You had to do more. And you had to start talking about innovation. And so they did. So if you look at those annual reports, in the 1970s, the word R&D and/or innovation was mentioned all of 4 times. 4 times in the annual report they mentioned R&D. 2 times because there was someone whose title contains R&D somewhere, right? Manager of R&D or something like that. In 2014, they mentioned it 200 times. So you could say, okay, they start paying attention, right? Innovation is getting kind of important. But did they also put their money where their mouth is? Actually, they did. Well, we don't know where they put their money in the 1970s because it's not reported. Innovation was not, or R&D was not considered worth mentioning even in the annual reports as a separate line item in the tables. But as of the 1980s, they started reporting it. And since then, the investment in innovation, and this is a lower estimate because it's just R&D that I'm looking at here, because the rest, like venturing and all of those things, don't really get mentioned that explicitly. So the lower estimate of R&D intensity has almost tripled since then. What you also notice is that capital intensity has decreased significantly, and this, of course, is a result of the whole operational excellence exercise, because if you're outsourcing a lot of your manufacturing, then you need to invest less in factories, and you have your supply chain invest in that. And actually, that is getting so complicated by now that a lot of companies are struggling. They have dispersed their supply chain, their manufacturing so far, that they're struggling to keep a hold of it. And that's a big inspiration for the whole Industry 4.0 development that we see going on now. And if you're curious about that, you should definitely go listen to Katrina Westerhoff, my colleague Katrina Westerhoff, later today. So, going back to this graph, what you'll notice is that R&D intensity and capital intensity are at the same level right now. For Volkswagen, that is. And what does it mean to an investor? It means that if I were an investor in Volkswagen, there's a couple of questions I would ask at the annual shareholder meetings that I'll get to in a moment, but there's also the question that I would pay as much attention to where all of that capital expenditure is going as I would to where all of the innovation spending is going. So innovation is being scrutinized way more, I would say infinitely more, than it was in 1975 when it wasn't even mentioned in the annual report. And the question to you is, do you have the metrics? Do you have the rigorous explanation? Can you prove that that money is being spent correctly, that you're being effective with that money? Because the capital expenditure people can. They have rigorous models. They have net present values for building new factories. They have the whole set of tools and methods, and you may have your opinions about it, right? And they may not always be applicable, but they have them. They have clear metrics and clear methodologies to justify investments. Now, do you? At the same time, you can show success, right? As innovation spending increased, also the product life cycle decreased. So Volkswagen was able to put out newer models faster, and that's where the Volkswagen Golf is an interesting example. And you can see that between the first 2 editions, it took 10 years, and then progressively it took 9 years, 8 years, 6, 5, and finally 4. So almost a factor 3 increase in spending, almost a factor 3 increase in the rate of changing your models. And spend a lot of time now looking at Volkswagen, but the automotive industry is certainly not the only one that's affected. So if you look at how the ratio of growth of R&D expenditure to growth of revenue, you see that for almost all industries, R&D intensity is growing faster than revenues are growing. In other words, innovation is getting a bigger and bigger and bigger share of revenue, except for pharmaceuticals, where they've kind of hit a wall and are already doing a number of things that probably all of you should be considering. And if you're curious about that, you need to stay a while after you've listened to Katrina Westerhoff and also listen to John Melnick, who is going to share a number of lessons learned from the pharmaceutical industry. So, and then there's another point that I would like to raise, which is innovation can actually be life-threatening to your company. So Volkswagen made an innovation mistake in defining in inventing their new diesel line of cars. And that mistake actually, I would say right now, has killed the diesel car. Diesel car doesn't stand a chance anymore. There are, right now, the sign you see here, and for those who don't speak German, it just says diesel cars up to and including Euro 5 are prohibited from entering here, except if you live in that street. Up to and including Euro 5 means any diesel cars from 2015 and before cannot enter that street. And there are signs appearing like that in 68 German cities at the moment. 68 German cities means if you own a diesel car from 2015 or before, can't go anywhere in Germany, basically. A bit on the countryside, but that's about it. Right? And that's the direct consequence of what happened with diesel innovation. And there's more companies making mistakes in innovation. Right? The only cell phone ever to make it to the airline safety announcements, explicitly. So, you must innovate. If you don't, you fail and the decline will be rapid. You are innovating. You're spending more on innovation. You're speeding. It's fun, but it's also dangerous. You're now in the spotlight because innovation investments match capital investments. And if you move too quickly and cut corners, it can actually be dangerous. And just to add to the Volkswagen saga, just a week ago, the German authorities announced that they will also be pressing charges against Volkswagen's, at the time, CEO, Mr. Winterkorn, for aggravated fraud, which is a pretty serious accusation. So what do? Well, you need to solve a number of paradoxes, right? You must improve efficiency because clearly, while everyone's spending more on innovation and innovation spending is growing faster than revenue growth, there must be a limit to that. You cannot go on doing that. You must improve your efficiency. You must also reduce risk, but you need to be predictable. Like the capital expenditure people. When you build a factory, you know it's going to produce something, in the case of Volkswagen cars. So you need to be predictable, but you also need to be creative. So how do you apply rigorous processes and also not stifle creativity? And you need to manage quality. You don't want a Dieselgate. So what is your next move? You need to innovate innovation. But how? Well, let's take a look. I think there's two things we need to look at to figure out how to innovate innovation. One is we need to look at data and automation. And I'll explain you in a moment first why that is. And then once we have done that, we can talk about metrics. And I think there's work to be done on metrics for all of you. And for us, by the way. The reason I'm talking about this here, of course, is that innovating innovation means that you take better decisions. And the thing that we're passionate about at Lux is to help you take those better decisions. So yes, I'm talking about data and automation, and we sell you data, but we do it for a reason. We do it because we think that will actually improve innovation. So here's your main challenges, and these are the challenges that are coming out of the IRI survey in 2018. Now, unless your year is very different from last year, these are still your challenges. And I think they are because they have been. This is essentially the job description of any innovation manager. Right? You know these are the challenges. And you've acted on them. You have a great tool set. We know how to do innovation. Right? We have road mapping, we have megatrends, and if you're curious more about megatrends, I highly encourage you to go listen to Cosmin Laszlo, which will force you to stay the entire conference, which is a good thing anyway. But he'll be talking about that, right? You have valuation of projects. I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but you can see that these all map quite nicely to the challenges you have. So good. We don't need to innovate innovation. We're done. We have all the tools. We know how to do it. Right? So that's a bit of an anticlimax, right? And of course, I'm not going to let that happen because I think you have all the tools, but you're probably not using them effectively. Who is convinced that he's getting the most out of all of these tools and using them really well coordinated among you? I don't need to see a show of hands here, but if you are convinced, please come see me after my talk, because I would really like to talk to you. Why are you not using them effectively? One of the things, if you look at stage gating, for example, we've asked clients regularly, how do you apply those stage gate criteria? Do you apply them very rigorously, or do you apply them kind of indicatively and say, well, okay, yeah, my stage gate criteria says I should reject the project, but I know that this project could in the future be important, so let's continue, right? Who's done that? I'm pretty sure a lot of you have done that. We find in many cases where people are not doing that, it's in a very well-defined environment where you're doing incremental innovations on very well-defined markets and products. So to do them, to use those tools properly, to use them effectively, there are two missing pieces, I think. There is data and automation. To use these tools well, you need a lot of data, and you need unbiased data. So the unfortunate thing is you cannot always rely on your own internal experts, because these own internal experts do not like their project killed. They like their project to continue. So they'll be honest. They'll give you correct information, but they may be biased, right? And you need to integrate your tool set. Who can say for sure that if you change your roadmap, that your stage gate criteria are reflecting the changes in your roadmap? So let's take a look at those, right? And as a good consultant, I have two missing pieces, so I'll just put them on two axes to create 4 quadrants, of course. And I labeled them as such. So basically, my thesis is we're now in Innovation Management 1.0. Right, which is pretty good, right? It's not a bad place to be. We have evolved a lot in innovation, but there's other places to go. If you focus really on getting the better data and getting more automation into your processes, and getting, for example, automatic evaluation of stage gate criteria and those kind of things, you can go into R&D automation. You can go in that direction, and you end up with a highly efficient process of innovating. But maybe not a very, and it will be very predictable and all that, but it may not be that creative, right? You may be kind of blindfolded. You can also focus on tying all of your tools together, making them work really well orchestrated. And then what you're basically doing is what enterprises have been doing with enterprise resource management, where you're tying your sales and your accounting and your billing and all of that together with your inventory and look at the whole picture in one go. And that's why we call that innovation resource management. And we'll see a number of examples of those. But of course, the more compelling option is to do both simultaneously, and we'll get to how to do that in a minute. Let's take a deeper dive in each of those quadrants, just see what it looks like, right? Innovation Management 1.0, for example. A good example there is Nourion's Imaging Chemistry Challenge, which will happen again in a month from now. Now this is I think, a best-in-class example. Of course I think that because we're involved. But I really do think it's a best-in-class example. So what they do is they define challenges, they post them on the website, they ask for ideas to the world, they refine those ideas because their scientists will engage with people who submit ideas and they will ask questions. And then those enriched ideas get selected, and a number of them, usually about 15, get invited to go to a 2-day meeting where the purpose is not to pitch the idea, but the purpose is to turn the idea into a joint development with Nourion, formerly Akzo Nobel. And then they select. So, and that actually works. And here's one example. One of the winners of last year is Waternight. And you can see the 2 winners here looking very happy. And Waternight is doing a thing called cavitation. So they purify water using cavitation, which is not a very new idea. We know cavitation can do that, and what happens is when cavitation bubbles implode, you get OH radicals, and OH radicals are able to basically oxidize a lot of hydrocarbons, including microorganisms. The problem is cavitation also destroys the equipment, which is why it's dreaded by many people. And these guys managed to make cavitation do what it's good at without destroying the equipment. And that's why they won at Akzo. And Akzo, or I should say Nourion now, would never have met these people without this challenge. Now, the problem here is, while it's a very good process, it's also very laborious. They have 2 or 3 people working on it nearly continuously. And the result of all of that work is 2 or 3 projects every year. Right, so they connect to the outside world, but it's a lot of work. If we look at R&D automation, there's a lot of tools there. Nowadays, you can outsource a lot of R&D, right? You can outsource screening of catalysts, for example, right? So there's a lot of those kind of tasks that you can automate. And one of the tools that I would like to look at, which you can learn more about in our materials section later today, is really about materials informatics. And you'll see that we're very bullish on material informatics. We think it's something you should be paying attention to. And the example here, and you can see here our Lux Innovation Grid on material informatics. And you can see that there's not a lot of companies, but there's quite a few good companies. And one of them is Uncountable, who's somewhere there in the middle of that innovation grid. So not even the best one. And they're working with Cooper Standard, who supplies materials to car OEMs. And Cooper Standard has the problem that many of those suppliers to car OEMs has, which is they need to come up with different compounds, with different formulations for much the same materials, depending on new specs that the car manufacturer is telling them to use. So, and that's sort of a science, but it's also an art to make those compounds. So they started working with Uncountable to use material informatics. And here you see a picture of where all of their products go. And you can imagine, for example, the rubber lining of those doors. Car manufacturers want different rubber linings because they're changing the door material, they're changing their mind about what weather conditions it should work in and all that. Together with Uncountable, they managed to find the right compound in half the time with only half the resources. R&D automation. You can also go to innovation resource management. And a good example there is Bright Idea. So again, think of this as enterprise resource management just specific to innovation. So this is your SAP or your Salesforce geared towards innovation. So Bright Idea has all of the innovation tools in one integrated framework. And transformation is their language for, I would call that implementation, making the technology accepted by your organization, right? And so there's not a lot of data or automation involved here, but it means that at least all of the data integrity is guaranteed. So if you put something in one end, in the ecosystem part, for example, you say party A can perform this kind of thing, it will also show up in labs and programs. And comparing to what Nourion did, if you look at what Bright Idea did with Cisco, they got 5,000 users submitting 400 ideas and implement 10 in less than a year. So compared to the Imagine Chemistry thing, this is a tremendous acceleration, and it can even be faster, where with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, they got 31,000 users involved and started 113 projects. So just by managing the resources better, tremendous acceleration. But of course, Innovation Management 2.0, I need to mention something of Lux, right? My coin is still standing there in the back of the room. I have to do something about this. So I'll mention proudly our Lux 299 radar. And why? Well, first of all, I don't think this is Innovation 2.0 proper. It is a start. It's a glimpse of what's possible in the future. But it's a glimpse we're very proud of. So this is a tool where we monitor technology. We monitored 3,000 of them, and we've selected the top 299. And you can look at those, and you can see how much activity there is. So there are activity levels ranging from 1 to 5. 5 means there's lots of activity. This technology is moving at a tremendous speed. Everyone's patenting all over the place, and there's publications and investments and all that. And 1 means, oh, it's there, but it's not that. There's things happening. You should pay attention, but it's also not going so super fast, right? So suppose you're an automotive company, and you look at all of the things that are relevant in digital, energy, materials and other for your industry. And you look at this, and probably if you're working in an automotive company, you're not too surprised by this picture. You say, okay, most of those technologies I saw coming, but suppose you're a bit surprised by how active connected cars are. You say, oh, okay, that's something I didn't expect to see. Connected car, I thought it was a bit slower, so let's take a deep dive. What's happening here? And then our system will help you do that. So you can take a deep dive in connected cars. You can go to our tech page. You can look who's working on that actually. You can see what patenting activity is happening there, why it's so active. You can also compare that to what kind of things are happening with academic papers. You can actually take a deeper dive and look at what kind of patents are being applied for right now. So you can go in one go from monitoring to getting the full picture on what's happening in this technology and actually getting a few leads for partners or for competitors that you need to watch out for. And like I said, we want to go further. We want to go to more data and automation enabled and more integration of those tools. But this is a first glimpse. So going back to the grid, you can plot a lot of things there, and you can, for example, see that in R&D automation, there's a lot of technologies there, like finite element analysis and computational fluid dynamics and material informatics. That's because if we plotted all of the vendors there, they would end up at the same point, because they're all basically doing more or less the same. The bottom half, the integration of the tool set, you can see a lot of vendors there, because there is not a word, there's not a technology really that's well defined there. There's a lot of vendors doing different things. It's really a space that's really in evolution. And of course, you can see our journey there as well. And we're adding more dots to the equation there. Data and automation. So, if you've done data and automation, you're not done yet. I told you you had work to do on metrics. Why is that? Well, you've got your cockpit if you do the data and automation, but you still need to know where to take the plane, right? Where will you go? Wasn't that something Microsoft used to ask you every morning 5 years ago or something? Where do you want to go today? Data and automation. So, and I think you need to distinguish between two types of innovation. Of course I do. Everyone does, right? Incremental and disruptive, or, you know, I have another proposal here. I would like to distinguish between operational and expensive. Now, the pun is kind of funny there, so it's expensive with an A, right? It's not necessarily not cheap, although I'm pretty sure it won't be cheap, but it's really about expanding. So what are these things? Well, operational innovation is really, by now, part of your core operation. It's not optional. If you do not develop the next generation of your product, you will cease to exist. You need to do this. It's not optional. It's an essential part of your operation, and it must succeed. It's not an option to say, well, I'll just not develop the next Volkswagen Golf. Well, why bother? So this has to work, right? Expensive innovation, on the other type, is optional. It serves to expand your business. It's a wager you make, if you like, on getting into a new market or launching an entirely new product into your existing market. And what you want to do there is you want to build a portfolio of options. And I might note that your stage gating is doing quite the opposite of building a portfolio. If you're evaluating all of your projects with the same lens, with the same criteria, you're not building a portfolio of diversified options. You're building a portfolio of exactly the same options. So you're not hedging your bets there, which is great for operational innovation, not great for expensive. Right? So if you look at the governance, right, operational innovation should be governed by whatever governs your operations, which usually is efficiency. Right? And what you want to do is you want to deliver on time at the lowest possible cost. And you probably want to prove to your investors that you did achieve the lowest possible cost. So you want to optimize for cost. And you want to focus a lot on R&D automation, for example. And you want to focus on data-enabled projects. And you want to look at automated technology tracking, so you know you're not developing something that has been developed elsewhere already that you could easily buy. For expensive innovation, on the other hand, you want to look at investment metrics. Essentially, you want to beat the return on equity of your company. Because why would you invest in something that expands your business if it's dragging down your return on equity? You don't want to do that. It's very hard to explain to your shareholders that you want to do that. Of course, you're going to take more risk if you do this, because you're venturing into lands unknown, right? So you need to correct for that risk. So you want to beat your return on equity, but you want to beat it also to compensate for the added risk. How do you do that? So you want to optimize your portfolio. So what you want is automated market research, still automated technology tracking, but also, and most importantly, you want a good risk assessment. Who here is confident about your risk assessment? Who goes beyond gut feeling in the risk assessment and can produce actual numbers on those innovations that you're working on, right? I see a couple of hands, not a lot of volunteers around here. We'll talk after. So what I think will happen is operational innovation will take you to Innovation Management 2.0 if you do it properly through R&D automation. You'll focus first on R&D automation, on efficiency, and then you'll progress to integrating your tools. Whereas expensive innovation will take the other route. And that's really interesting to note, because if you're doing both, you actually can make them work together, and you should be able to have a very interesting journey towards improving your innovation performance. So you need to innovate innovation. You need to look at data and automation. You need to define clear metrics. You're one of those two basic functions, and here we're looking down, but innovating this innovation will enable you to look up to a bright sky, a colorful bright sky, I might add. So what are your takeaways? What should you do when you go out of here? Well, let's start by just seeing where you are. We would be happy, we would be thrilled to put you on the map. And putting you on the map on that 2x2, seeing if perhaps you are already in Innovation Management 2.0, who knows? You do that by having us interview you. We don't have a survey. We looked at having an online survey, but then we ended up asking you questions at how integrated do you think your tool set is? And we thought, well, we'll get completely incomprehensible answers there, because people will say, well, I think it's a 3 or something, and we still don't know what you're talking about. So we need to talk. And if you want to talk, we'd be very happy to do that. And you know how to reach us. You know there's client engagement managers, there's account managers. Get to me directly if you want to. All of that is possible for us to arrange a meeting and talk. You also have to define your metrics. Do you know what your benchmark is? How efficient does your innovation need to be? How do you measure the efficiency of your innovation? And how are you doing compared to your peers? Who is the most efficient car manufacturing at putting out a new model? Who is it? Frankly, I don't know, because it's very hard to get those metrics. On the other hand, for expensive innovation, I talked about that, right? Return on equity, how do you compensate for risk? How do you define risk? And finally, you need to get started really investing in data sources, automation, and process software. And a lot of that software will be custom made, much like in the early days of ERP. They will look a lot like a money sink, but I think it's an inevitable step. If you don't do it, you'll be behind. There will be better solutions that are easier to implement 5 or 6 years from now. But if you start learning then, you're quite a lot behind the front runners by that time. So you need to learn and maybe make a few mistakes now, but if you don't, you're really behind the curve. With that, with a cheerful thought, I will leave you today to the rest of our conference. There's many opportunities for you to dive deeper. I've just set up a framework here for you. I haven't been able to dive deeper, and already I'm getting an evil stare from Sarah for running over my time. So I wanted to be more ambitious and take a deeper dive, but time did not permit. But we do have time, and there's many of my colleagues talking about many aspects of this throughout today's conference. Thank you for your attention.